Hey there, lovely people. Welcome back to another Writing Tip Tuesday. I'm Sammy, and I'm really excited to start talking about showing versus telling when it has to do with pacing and trusting your readers. Now, it may seem like a lot, so let's go into each part individually. What is showing versus telling? You hear it all the time in writing spaces. It's always something that is a critique. Show, don't tell. What does it actually mean? Basically, you want to give your readers an experience while they're reading. You don't want to just give away all of the information. You want them to work for it a little bit. This could be like describing the scenery from the perspective of the character rather than just listing off the things. So like for my background here, telling would be there's a lamp on the desk, there's a monitor that's not turned on, and there's a tapestry behind it. But to do something more like showing would be the lamp had a tealish color, there was a graduation tassel dangling from it, somebody who sat here was educated, and the monitor was docile, but it looked ready, etc. Something that gives a little bit more character, personality, and meaning behind the things rather than just having them be there. So show versus tell means exactly what it sounds like, but it's also so complicated to know whether you're doing one or the other. Basically, a good way to think about this is with history. So if your world has a history, do you show it by giving a prologue of, let's say there was a war 50 years before the story takes place? Do you show a scene where a character who does not come back or does come back is in this war and how the war affected the world, and you have that prologue where you existed with the characters in it as it happened, and then you move to the story where it's now caused a change and an impact? Or do you have the character in like a history class where they discuss the war and what changed from before the war and after the war? That's telling, but it's done in a way that's more interesting than just saying, oh yeah, 50 years ago there was a war and now everything's changed. Do you see the difference? Both of those examples are giving the same information to the readers. They are just doing it in very different ways. They have different reasons for choosing one or the other, and they both aren't wrong, but they are very different. And you can see that in the prologue, you are showing because you are doing everything with the characters while it's happening in that time. And with the history class, you are telling your current main characters, the ones that are being affected by that thing that happened in the history, you're telling them what happened. And by telling them during class, you can have a reaction where they're like, we know about this, blah, 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 and like not really care or pay attention to something different, and just give the readers enough information that you don't have to have them sit through the whole class or whatever. You have more options to just dump it in and then move on than you do with the showing version. With the prologue, you have to give the whole story in that prologue version. When is it acceptable to tell something over show it? Like I just gave history of your world. It's very, very applicable. If you have like a totally different political state, you have a totally different world, like you drew a map and made a whole different space and everything's different, to give your readers enough that they know where they are, you can tell them. You don't have to show them unless you want to. History is one of those things that I think you should always tell, but tell in an interesting way. Put it into the story rather than like in ACOTAR, I brought up in my review, I brought up how her backstory of the history of the world felt very forced to me because it was through the inner monologue of the character rather than placed in a natural way. You can tell your history, but you should do it in a more interesting way than just having your character think about it, because why would your character be thinking about it besides to tell your readers? And that's sort of how you get into that trusting your readers thing, where it's like, we're not dumb. We know that you have to tell us how the world works and stuff, but you don't have to tell us that you're telling us, Backstory is always a good spot to use telling. Another spot that is allowed to use telling is if your character is finding something out with the reader in a way that they could not have been shown. Something that I think is an example, not to bring up another war, but it's so convenient if your character has a loved one at war and they find out that that loved one has died or been taken prisoner, and you're telling your story from a first-person perspective, your character would not know how that happened. They would not have witnessed it, but they would have been told by somebody else. So when that secondary character comes and tells your main character that their loved one has died or been taken prisoner, you can have that be told to them in that space, and you're telling your readers as well, but you have the opportunity to have like emotional responses to the information being told to your character and any kind of imagination or panic or whatever you need to have your character do when they are told that information to make it more engaging for your reader. You really want to use telling in as many limited situations as possible. So for both your backstory, you want to show it in a way that is more engaging than just thinking about the history of the world through your character's perspective. That's really just telling. You want to do as much of a blend as possible to keep your pacing up and keep your readers engaged and keep your readers knowing that you believe in them, that you know that they'll understand if you tell them more things have happened in this story, in the history, and scenes that have taken place out of the sight of your character, anything like that. You really want to limit how much telling you're doing, because if you have 4 pages of just this happened and then that happened and then this other thing happened and we all found out that this happened after it happened, it's really going to get boring and your readers are not going to be invested, and you really want your readers invested, and that's what showing really does for them. So how exactly does showing versus telling allow your readers to feel like you trust them? Your readers don't want you to hold their hand through the whole story. And that's how it can feel when you do too much showing, and that's how it can feel when you do too much telling. So you want to really find that balance for your story and what your story needs, because you don't want them to feel like you don't want them to experience the story. You don't want them to feel the author saying, "Come on, it's this way. Come on, come on." Nobody wants that while they're reading a story. They want to be in the story and not thinking about who the author was or what they were thinking or anything like that, because that's not what they care about. Unfortunately, I know we would all love for our writing to be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm reading a Sammi Shane novel. How exciting Sammi Shane is, blah, blah, blah." No, don't do it. Whether your ego wants it or not, don't do it. Please just trust your readers. Let them follow along at their pace. Speaking of pacing, following a story requires the reader to read each word. This is probably not something that a lot of people think too hard about while they're writing, especially if you are a big fan of classical writing and you really like prose in your writing, really like fluid word choice and pretty language, I guess. Putting in too much flowery language or like showing too much in detail or telling too much without giving a break to show really can make the pacing of the book clunky. So if you have a scene that takes 2 minutes in real time, but you use flowery language and you overly describe everything that's happening to show that the breeze blew as the trees and the thing, but your character is running through a forest and there's something chasing them and you're describing all of the landscape, you're really going to lose the pacing of the scene, because every single word that you write, your reader has to read each of them. And if you have a very fast-paced scene that you put a lot of showing, a lot of diction, a lot of words in between the action or the things that are going on, your reader is not going to feel that it's a fast-paced scene. They're going to be confused on how it's only been 2 minutes, but they've read 7 pages. So you really want to pay attention to that pacing, because you have to trust that your readers are going to catch on to the pace that you want the scene to be in, as long as you write the right amount of words. Another way of showing and telling relating to trusting your readers is that a lot of us have a tendency that when we are thinking about the backstory of our characters or of the world, we will have a lot of extra things that don't really need to go into the story, and we will put it into the story anyway because we thought of it. We need to stop doing that. And I say we because I do a lot of work before I write a story to know everything that I need to know know about the world and the school and the characters and who the characters' moms were. And even if the moms aren't in the story, I want to know who they were. And we need to stop putting all of that extra information in. Nobody cares that you did all of that work. It's very sad, but unless it directly relates to what is happening in the story right now, your backstory is not important in anything aside from developing your characters or your world. You need to know it. So you should be still doing that work, but you do not need to put it into the story. A lot of it is intuitive once you've established the story, and putting in the extra information will not make the story better for your readers. And it's another way of showing them that you don't trust them to pick up on your cues. We gotta stop putting in the extra. We did the work though. We did the work. I know, just don't put it in. If it doesn't need to be in there, don't put it in. Keep it in your notebook. It'll be a fun thing to release like J.K. Rowling does. It's important to remember that when you're thinking about showing versus telling, overly describing something is just as bad as giving too much exposition. You really need to focus on what the pacing is for that scene, how much of it is really necessary, and who is going to care. If it's just you, you probably don't need it. If it's you and your mom, you probably don't need it. If that information is going to make a comeback, like a little plot seed, then you can put it in and draw a little bit more attention to it, because plot seeds are great, and having those little drops of extra hints towards the story are fantastic. But if it's not going to come back and it doesn't really impact anything, just skip it. It's sad. I know. I love doing the work before writing and developing all the things for the story and who the people are and where everything takes place. But sometimes you just have to take out the information that doesn't directly relate to the story to keep the pacing up, to keep your readers engaged, to show that you trust your readers, and keep everything really as concise and clear and enjoyable as you can for your readers. So making sure that everything is really at its sweet spot is the hardest part, I think, of writing your stories. You really need to figure out the perfect balance between showing versus telling when it comes to everything. And it's going to take some practice. You're going to have to work on it over time and time again. Have some people read your work and see what is working for you, what is going a little bit clunky, anything like that. And you're gonna have to learn from your mistakes. And that is what writing is all about. It's just becoming better at your craft. And that's why we're here. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. It's really going to help me out and show YouTube that people are liking this, and then maybe more people would like it. Leave a comment below if you have a story that you can think of that does a really good job of balancing their showing versus telling, or a really bad job of balancing their showing versus telling. Let me know your recommendations and your anti-recommendations. I would love to hear about them. And we can have a little chat in the comments, talk about if I've read any of them, if any of them are going on to my reading list. And I will see you Saturday for another Story Study Saturday. And I will see you again on Tuesday for another Writing Tip Tuesday.